The winter wind of Cape Cod rattled against the windows, accompanying Carol Wilson's quiet dinner time. Carol sat alone at her small dining table, still in her hospital uniform, sipping chicken soup. Only the sound of the wall clock ticked regularly, as if confirming her existence. Carol's gaze suddenly turned to a photo frame displayed above the fireplace in the living room. Michael and their then 3-year-old son Noah, laughing on the beach. That photograph, taken in the beautiful summer sunshine of Cape Cod, now belonged to another life. November 18, 5 years ago. The weather forecast that day predicted calm seas. Michael was delighted to take Noah on his first fishing adventure with Dad. Carol saw them off at the pier, joking, "Make sure you bring back some fish." Who could have imagined that would be the last thing she ever said to them? That afternoon, an unexpected strong gust hit the bay. When Carol realized Michael's fishing boat hadn't returned, it was nearly dusk. In response to Carol's anxious call, the Coast Guard began their search. After days of extensive searching, all they found was Michael's wedding ring and some parts of the boat that had drifted out to sea. Everyone concluded that the two had been swallowed by the ocean. "Please accept this, Mrs. Wilson." The police officer handed her a small transparent bag containing Michael's wedding ring, scratched from exposure to the waves. Carol clutched it and collapsed to her knees. Those days were filled with a sense of loss and grief. Without the support of her doctor friend Amy and Michael's sister Linda, Carol might never have recovered. Linda stayed at Carol's house for a while after her brother's funeral to ensure she wasn't alone. The Johnsons from next door brought homemade meals twice a week. The warmth of the small town embraced Carol. "Carol, come stay with us," her parents, who lived far away in Florida, urged repeatedly. But Carol couldn't let go of this house.
Can you imagine making $10,000 a month just from YouTube, all from home? That's exactly what I did with Reddit stories. No face, no voice. Check the link in the description if you're curious.
It was the only place where Michael and Noah's laughter had seeped into the walls, the place where she could feel their presence most strongly. As time passed, Carol gradually regained her daily routine. She began working as a nurse at the local hospital, finding joy especially in her work in the pediatric ward. The children's smiles healed her heart's wounds bit by bit. She also started volunteering for a grief counseling group for people who had experienced similar losses. She believed her own experience could help support others. Now, 5 years later, Carol had found a way to live forward while carrying her grief. Every morning, she said, "Good morning," to Michael and Noah's photos, and every night, "Good night." Sometimes, she would sit by the shore, listening to the sound of the waves while talking to them. Deep in her heart, there was a part of her that would always wait for their return. That night, Carol was on her way home after finishing her night shift. The cold November rain beat against the windshield, with the wipers moving busily. Her tired mind was filled with thoughts of a little girl she was caring for at the hospital. While thinking about tomorrow's treatment plan, she parked her car in front of her house. The lights of a police vehicle shining in the rain caught her attention. Had something happened? Was there trouble at a neighbor's house? Carol leaned forward to look. However, the police officer was standing in front of her house. Feeling her heartbeat quicken, Carol got out of the car. A young police officer walked toward her. In the rain, his uniform was wet, and his expression seemed stern. "Are you Carol Wilson? There's an urgent matter to discuss." Carol tensed at his serious demeanor. She had an intuition that something bad had happened. "Your husband and son have been taken to the emergency room after a traffic accident." The police officer's words reached Carol's ears clearly, drowning out the sound of the rain. For a moment, she doubted her hearing. "What did you say?" Carol's voice trembled. She felt as if all the blood was draining from her body. "Michael Wilson and your child were in a car that was involved in an accident on the interstate highway. They have been transported to Memorial Hospital." The officer continued in an official tone. Each of his words tore at Carol's sense of reality. "But, they died 5 years ago." Carol finally managed to utter these words. The police officer's expression changed completely. His face clouded in the rain as he stared at Carol. "What did you just say?" The police officer and Carol stared at each other as if time had stopped. Carol felt something shattering in her mind. Was this a bad joke, or was she so tired that she was hearing things? 5 years ago, my husband and son went missing in a fishing boat. They were certified dead in a maritime accident. At her words, the police officer's face showed confusion. He took out a small notebook from his pocket, leaning to shield it from the rain as he flipped through the pages. According to the ID information, it's definitely Michael Wilson, 35 years old. And the child is Noah, Carol said, almost choking. Noah Wilson. He would be 8 years old now. The police officer checked his notes again with a confused expression. Yes, that's right. The wallet found in the car contained Michael Wilson's identification and this address. Carol felt her feet wobble. She leaned against the gate fence to support herself. This must be some mistake. Or perhaps a cruel prank, or some malicious scheme. "I want to go to the hospital right away," Carol said with determination. "Of course. I'll take you in my car." In the rain, the police vehicle drove along the wet roads of Cape Cod without its siren. Carol tried to look at the scenery outside the window, but all she could see were fragments of 5 years of memories. Her wedding to Michael, Noah's birth, the last view of the pier where she saw them off. And the cruel sea that left behind Michael's damaged wedding ring. Unconsciously, she touched the middle finger where she still wore that ring. "Another form of identification was found in your husband's accident vehicle," the police officer said quietly. "The name is Ethan Jones." Carol looked at the officer in surprise. "Ethan Jones?" "Yes. Driver's license, insurance card, credit cards, all under that name. However, Michael Wilson's identification was found in a hidden pocket of the wallet." As Carol's confusion grew, the officer continued to explain the details of the accident. There had been a collision with a large truck on the interstate highway. Michael's car had hit the median barrier, the driver was seriously injured, and the child in the back seat had relatively minor injuries. "The child. Noah is all right." Carol's voice was a mixture of hope and fear. "Yes, thankfully his life is not in danger." "However." The officer hesitated. "What is it?" "The child says his name is Ethan Jones." At those words, Carol felt her heart constrict painfully. If it really was Noah, why would he have a different name? Had 5 years taken away his memory of his real mother? Was this really her family? Questions and anxieties swirled in Carol's mind. "There's one more thing I need to confirm," the officer continued with a solemn expression. "There was a woman in the passenger seat. Rebecca Jones. She's also injured and has been taken to the same hospital." Rebecca Jones. Carol had heard that name before. The accountant at the construction company where Michael had worked. She had met her once at a company party. A woman with beautiful brown hair and a charming smile. She and Michael? Carol couldn't find the right words to ask. According to the car documents, they were registered as husband and wife. Those words brought a dull pain to Carol's heart. If this was true, her husband hadn't died at all. He had abandoned her and their son, and started a new life with another woman. But why take Noah too? Why such a cruel deception? Upon arriving at the hospital, Carol followed the police officer in on shaky legs. After giving her name at the reception, a senior physician and the hospital's social worker immediately appeared. "Mrs. Wilson, this is a very complicated situation," the doctor said quietly. "Your husband is unconscious and in critical condition. He has suffered serious head trauma and is currently being treated in the intensive care unit. Your child has minor injuries but is experiencing psychological shock," the social worker added. She looked at Carol with a warm expression. Especially since the situation is unusual. Is it really them? Carol asked in a trembling voice. Are they really my husband and son? We've confirmed the identification and fingerprints. It is definitely Michael Wilson, the doctor said, but immediately became vague. However, the child still seems confused, the social worker said quietly. He says his name is Ethan, not Noah. Tears welled up in Carol's eyes. Her body shook with waves of emotion. Anger, confusion, sadness, and a small hope. If Noah was alive, perhaps her prayers had been answered in a different way. I'll take you to the child's room, the doctor said carefully. But before that, I should inform you that the female patient, Rebecca Jones, is already with the child. Carol just nodded silently. The hospital corridor was filled with the smell of disinfectant and silence. Each of Carol's steps felt like an eternity. The social worker, Judith Morris, walked beside her, occasionally casting worried glances. Here we are. Judith stopped in front of a room in the pediatric ward. Through the translucent glass, she could see silhouettes around the bed. Carol's heart was beating so hard it felt like it might break through her chest. Are you ready? Judith asked quietly. Carol couldn't speak. She just nodded slightly. For 5 years, she hadn't seen her son's face. Hadn't held him. Hadn't heard his voice. That Noah was behind this door, but would he remember her? Judith gently opened the door. Carol rushed to the hospital. The moment I looked into the room, I was speechless, my body trembling with anger. In the room, a strange woman was sitting beside the bed, holding the hand of a small boy with bandages. The moment she saw this scene, Carol's body froze like stone. A boy about 8 years old. Light brown curly hair. A nose shape similar to Michael's. And definitely Carol's own eye color. It was Noah. Time had changed him over 5 years, but he was certainly her son. The woman sitting beside the bed turned around. The moment Carol saw her face, her anger flared up like a flame. Rebecca Jones. The woman who had once been the accountant at Michael's company. She had a bandage on her forehead and a cast on her arm. When Rebecca's eyes met Carol's, she lost color in her face from surprise and slowly stood up. You. Carol. Her voice was filled with fear. The air in the room froze. Carol felt her body shaking with mixed emotions of anger and sadness. She stepped forward, almost about to confront Rebecca, but her eyes were drawn to the small figure on the bed. Noah stared at Carol with a clearly confused expression. He anxiously leaned toward Rebecca, as if seeking protection. That gesture tore Carol's heart into 1,000 pieces. He was alive. Carol's voice trembled. Beneath her anger swirled 5 years of sadness and sense of loss. Rebecca couldn't answer and just looked at the child. Mom, who is this person? Noah asked Rebecca. His voice was high-pitched and trembling with fear. Those words pierced Carol's heart. Mom. He was calling Rebecca Mom. Carol's son was calling another woman his mother. That reality crushed Carol. Ethan, it's okay, Rebecca tried to reassure the child. Her voice was clearly upset. Ethan. Carol said sharply. His name is Noah Wilson. My son's name. Feeling the tension rising in the room, Judith placed her hand on Carol's arm. Mrs. Wilson, let's talk in the hallway. But Carol didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on Noah. He had grown up so much. From the little boy she had last seen at 3 years old, he had grown into a fine young boy. There was a small cut on his cheek and a bandage around his forehead. But otherwise, he seemed all right. Noah. Carol instinctively called out her son's name. My name is Ethan, the boy said with a confused expression. Who are you? At those words, tears flowed from Carol's eyes. He didn't remember her. Her son didn't know his real mother. The social worker appeared from the next room and led Carol into the hallway. "Mrs. Wilson, this is a difficult situation. Your child doesn't seem to remember you. Michael is in another room, unconscious. He has sustained serious injuries requiring surgery." Judith's voice seemed to come from far away. Carol's mind was filled with confusion and anger. The 5 years she had spent crying every night. The 5 years she had desperately tried to accept her husband and son's death. All that time, they had been alive. Michael had betrayed her, taken her son, and started a new life with another woman. "Please tell me. What exactly is going on?" Carol said in a trembling voice. "That woman is Rebecca Jones. A former colleague of my husband. Why is she with my son? Why does my son call her mom?" "The police are investigating," Judith said carefully. "I understand how you feel. This is an absolutely shocking situation." At that moment, 2 police officers appeared in the hospital corridor. The young officer who had brought Carol to the hospital and an older detective. They approached Carol and Judith. "Mrs. Wilson," the older detective said. "I'm Detective David Collins. New information has been found during the investigation at the accident scene." Carol nodded quietly. Any information might help make sense of the current confusion. "In Michael Wilson's wallet, we found multiple forms of identification under the name Ethan Jones, as well as what appears to be a marriage certificate with Rebecca Jones." The detective continued, choosing his words carefully. "Also, documents with an address in Portland, Oregon were found in the car's glove compartment. We're currently investigating the person who lived at that address." "Oregon?" Carol asked in surprise. "The West Coast?" "Yes. According to the evidence, it seems Michael deliberately disappeared 5 years ago and started a new life with Rebecca Jones. It appears he took your child with him." To the trembling, angry Carol, the detective quietly continued, "Also, a large amount of cash and statements from multiple bank accounts were found in the car. There were unusual money movements, and we're investigating the possibility of fraudulent activities." Carol's mind was spinning. This was a situation beyond her understanding. To think Michael was such a person. She had loved and trusted her husband. She thought he was an honest and kind man. But now, he seemed like a completely different person. Carol looked again at the room where her son was hospitalized. Through the glass, she could see Ethan's anxious expression. He looked at her with an expression of fear and confusion. Her heart was breaking. "He doesn't remember me." Tears welled up in Carol's eyes. "My baby, my son. It's difficult for a 3-year-old child to remember his real mother after 5 years, Judith said gently. Especially if his memories were deliberately replaced. In the midst of mixed feelings of anger and sadness, Carol made a decision. To get her son back. Even if he didn't remember her, even if he didn't call her mom, she was determined to do anything to rebuild her relationship with her son. "I want to meet Rebecca," Carol suddenly said. "I want to talk to her." Detective Collins hesitated a bit before nodding. "For a short time. However, since this could become a criminal case, please don't discuss too many details." Carol tried to calm her heart with deep breaths. But inside her, a storm was raging. Trembling with anger and sadness, she prepared to face Rebecca again. When she returned to the hospital room, Rebecca was putting Noah to bed. She tensed up when she saw Carol enter. "Why? Why did you do this?" Carol's voice was trembling. She was desperately trying to control her anger. She wanted to avoid letting her emotions explode in front of her son. Rebecca began to speak tearfully. "Michael, he wasn't happy with his life with you. We were in love and..." 5 years, Carol said quietly, but with intense anger. For 5 years, I cried every day thinking they were dead. You stole my life." At that moment, the door opened, and a doctor appeared urgently in the hallway. "Michael Wilson's condition has changed suddenly. We're moving him to the ICU," he announced. Carol, in the midst of her confused emotions, decided to go to the ICU to see her former husband. The heavy security door of the ICU opened, and the smell of disinfectant became even stronger. Being led by the doctor, Carol was trying to prepare herself mentally. The machine sounds characteristic of the intensive care unit echoed quietly, creating an atmosphere of tension. "Here we are." The doctor pointed to a semi-private area. Carol took a deep breath and stepped beyond the curtain. Carol was shocked by the sight of her once beloved husband. Michael was surrounded by life support equipment, his face swollen, his head wrapped in bandages. Intubation tubes were inserted into his nose and mouth, and only the movement of his chest rising and falling told that he was still alive. The regular sound of the monitor broke the silence. "The head injury is extremely serious. We're preparing for emergency surgery to reduce brain pressure," the doctor explained quietly. "Frankly speaking, the prognosis is uncertain." Carol silently approached Michael's bedside. The doctor stepped outside the curtain to give them time alone. "Why?" Carol whispered. "Why did you do this?" Michael, still unconscious, didn't answer. But Carol had many things she needed to say. She poured out all the anger, sadness, and questions of the past 5 years. "I looked for you both every day. Cried every day. Thought the sea had taken you," her voice shook. "But really it was you who took my son from me." She sat down, supporting her forehead with both hands. Then suddenly, her eyes stopped on Michael's vulnerable hand. There was no wedding ring on the ring finger of his left hand. The ring that had supposedly been recovered from the sea 5 years ago was carefully stored in Carol's jewelry box. Was that ring also part of the deception? "You abandoned us. Took Noah. Gave him another mother." Her voice was filled with deep sadness rather than anger. "He doesn't remember me. He doesn't know his real name." As time passed, Carol's anger gradually changed to a feeling of fatigue. By the time dawn broke and morning light began to filter through the gaps in the curtains, she was taking a nap on the sofa. "Mrs. Wilson." Carol woke up to a quiet voice. Detective Collins was standing there. His expression was even more serious than last night. "I have something to tell you. New information has come in." Carol slowly got up, glanced at Michael, and followed the detective. In the hospital cafeteria, they received coffee. "With our investigation so far, we have a fairly clear overall picture," the detective quietly began. "It seems Michael and Rebecca had been planning this for 5 years. Carol gasped. They were living in Portland, Oregon as Ethan Jones and Rebecca Jones. Michael worked as a construction consultant, and Rebecca was a stay-at-home mom taking care of the boy. He paused a moment, choosing his words, the boy who was raised as Ethan. Carol gripped her coffee cup tightly. But there was the most shocking fact, the detective lowered his voice. "It seems they were after your life insurance policy worth $3 million. My insurance?" Carol was confused. "Your husband had taken out a high-value life insurance policy in your name. But he was also a beneficiary. If you were reported dead, the insurance money would be paid to him. And somehow, they planned to take that money." Carol shook her head. "But I haven't received any insurance money. I applied, but the investigation has been delayed because there were no bodies." "That seems to have been their miscalculation," the detective explained. "Because you hired a lawyer and demanded a thorough investigation, they had to abandon their plan. And so, they continued their separate life." Carol was speechless. For such a plan, Michael had ruined her and their sons' lives. For money. "The Oregon police have also begun their investigation," the detective continued. Their bank accounts, workplace, inquiries to neighbors, everything is in progress. 3 days later, Michael regained consciousness. Carol visited his hospital room with the police. Michael opened his eyes wide in surprise and fear. He still couldn't speak, but he clearly understood the situation. "Michael," Carol said calmly. "Why?" He closed his eyes for a while, then answered in a thin voice. "Sorry." A few days later, when Michael's condition stabilized, he was formally questioned by the police. Carol was also present. Realizing he couldn't escape, Michael confessed everything. He had been unhappy with his life with Carol and had an affair with Rebecca. They wanted to be together, but thought Carol wouldn't easily agree to a divorce and wouldn't give up custody of their son. So, they came up with this plan. He admitted everything, aiming for the insurance money, faking the fishing boat accident, trying to erase the mother's existence from Noah's memory. "He cried for the first few months," Michael said, lowering his gaze. "He remembered you and called for Mama. But Rebecca, she was persistent. Gradually, she rewrote his memories." Those words tore Carol's heart. Her little son being taken away by a strange woman and made to forget his real mother, it was a cruelty beyond imagination. "I loved you," Carol said tearfully. Michael couldn't answer. His eyes showed regret. But it was too late now. Meanwhile, the relationship with Noah was complicated. At first, he was wary of Carol. But with the help of a child psychologist, Carol tried to gradually get closer to her son. She visited Noah's hospital room and showed him photos from when he was a baby. She talked about pictures of their home in Cape Cod, about his favorite toys, about the memories they shared. "This is your second birthday," Carol gently pointed to a photo. "I made this cake myself. You always loved blue, so I used lots of blue icing." Noah silently stared at the photo. "I don't remember," he said in a small voice. "That's okay," Carol said gently. "You don't have to try to remember." A few days later, when Carol visited the hospital room, Noah asked her a question for the first time. "Are you really my mom?" That simple question made Carol's heart tremble. "Yes, I am. I gave birth to you. But recently, Rebecca has been your mom. Is Dad a bad person?" Noah's eyes were full of anxiety. Carol carefully chose her words. "Dad made a big mistake, but I think he loved you." "What's my name?" he asked further. "Ethan. Or Noah." "When you were born, your name was Noah Wilson," Carol said quietly. "But recently, you've been raised as Ethan Jones." Noah was silent, deep in thought. Carol could painfully see that he was desperately trying to understand this complex situation. It was too heavy a reality for an 8-year-old child. "We have plenty of time," she said gently. "Let's get to know each other little by little." A week later, the court issued a temporary custody order. Noah was to be placed under Carol's legal custody, but considering his psychological stability, a gradual transition process was recommended. Under the supervision of a child psychologist, Carol and Noah would build a new relationship. Michael and Rebecca were charged with fraud and kidnapping. A long legal battle and prison term awaited them. As Carol left Noah's hospital room, she looked at the sea visible from the window. The same sea as 5 years ago. She had thought it was the sea that had taken her life, but that wasn't true. She was standing at the beginning of a new journey. 6 months later, the Cape Cod coastline was wrapped in gentle waves and warm sunshine. Carol sat on a blanket spread on the beach, watching Noah collecting seashells at the water's edge. The journey so far had been anything but smooth. During the first few weeks, Noah would often wake up crying in the middle of the night, calling for Rebecca. His little heart was struggling to understand the sudden change in his identity. "Mom, who am I? Noah? Or Ethan?" When he asked, Carol gently answered, "You are yourself. Names don't define a person." Twice-weekly sessions with child psychologist Dr. Brenda Matheny became their support. Children's memories and self-perception are flexible, the doctor said. Help him form a new identity while respecting both of his lives. Michael had been sentenced to 7 years and was serving his term in a state prison. He had sent numerous apology letters to Carol, but she wasn't ready to write back yet. Rebecca had received a 5-year sentence and was incarcerated in a different facility. One of the most difficult decisions was what to do about Rebecca and Noah's relationship. She wasn't legally his mother, but she was the person who had raised him for 5 years. After long struggles, Carol decided to allow supervised visits between Noah and Rebecca once a month. Who is my real mom? When Noah asked, Carol thought deeply before answering honestly, I gave birth to you and raised you for the first 3 years. But Rebecca also loved and raised you for 5 years. Both of us are your moms. Is Dad a bad person? When he continued to ask, Carol carefully chose her words. Dad made a big mistake, but I think he loved you. Noah had started attending a new school and was gradually making friends. Sometimes he was confused about whether he should be called Noah or Ethan, but he had learned to respond to both names. Carol said he could use either name until he chose for himself. Noah came running from the water's edge. In his hands was a beautiful spiral shell. Look, I found a beautiful shell, he said, his eyes shining. That's lovely, Carol smiled. Want to take it home and add it to your collection? Noah nodded happily and ran back to the beach. Carol watched his retreating figure and sighed deeply with relief. Though there were still wounds that hadn't healed, they were definitely moving forward. Carol had begun to think deeply about the meaning of family. She understood that it wasn't just about blood ties, but was built through love and a sense of responsibility. She had started to establish a support group for people in similar situations, using her own experience. What is a true family? Carol learned that it's not just about blood relations, but about love, honesty, and above all, a series of decisions that put the child's happiness first. Her life had taken a direction she never imagined, but still, she chose to look forward and live on. For Noah, and for herself.